Hey everyone, welcome to another On the Blue Line podcast. I am your host, Wayne Mulder, and I'm excited to be back with you yet again today. I hope you've been enjoying the last 2 weeks. We've had some really great episodes. If you haven't listened to those 2 interview room episodes, go back and check them out. I assure you it's going to be worth your time, and I'm assuring you you're going to enjoy them. Please, if you're watching this on YouTube, whatever video service you're watching it on, please leave us a comment. Please be sure to subscribe to the channel, and I would like to hear your feedback. To be honest with me, be brutally honest. Hey, do this, do that. I like this, I hate that. Let us know. That's the only way we improve, is to hear from you, those of you who are consuming the content, and I thank each and every one of you. This week is another interview room. Those are different than the morning roll calls. The interview room releases every Thursday, and in that one, like today's, I sit down with a different expert. They don't have to be in the law enforcement field. But what I do look for is something actionable that all of us, law enforcement and non-law enforcement, can either be made aware of, we can learn from, or something actionable that we can do in the weeks ahead. The other podcast that is coming out is Morning Roll Call. Those come out on Mondays, and those are just me and you sitting down and just discussing the week ahead. And I'm hoping that you're going to be seeing more of those on a more frequent basis than just once a week. However, those are future plans, and for now, let's just try to get done what we're doing. So, without taking any more time, let me tell you, today, this interview is all about leadership. So I don't care who you are. If you are corporal position on up to executive leadership, or if you work in the private sector, the things we are going to talk about today are not only actionable, they are going to save you as a supervisor, possibly keep you out of trouble, keep you out of the national news, and completely change your organization for the better. And if you think that's hyperbolic, I challenge you, listen to this entire podcast, listen to this entire interview, and I can guarantee you that if you take the truths and the experience to heart that this week's guest gives us, it will make a substantial difference when it comes to leadership in your life. So that's my challenge for you. Let me tell you, who is the guest? Well, the guest is Bob Woolverton. He spent 34 years working in law enforcement in a suburb of northeast of Seattle. 80% of that time was in upper level management positions, and he's going to go into his experience and how he learned the lessons that he shares with us today. He was a graduate of the FBI National Academy in Quantico. He holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in management and leadership, and he teaches and is an instructor at the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, specifically talking about leadership. One thing we did not discuss in the podcast, but I will be sure to link up in the show notes, so be sure to check it out, is his book that he authored, The Part of Leadership No One Talks About. I do extensively in the podcast talk about a LinkedIn article that he had written that he goes into a lot of the points from. And again, that is a great article if you are at any sort of leadership level at all. I can tell you, I picked up some things out of there that I will be implementing in my own life. So please, again, check out the show notes for that link. Bob currently owns and operates his leadership training company known as Top Tier Leadership Training, and his focus is on providing the knowledge, skills, and ability to anyone who wants to be in the top 20% of leaders who are truly inspirational leaders. And that's what today is all about. So without taking any more time, here's this week's guest, Bob Woolverton. All right, Bob. Well, welcome to the show.
Well, good morning, Wayne. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I'm glad we could make this work. First time we tried to do it, my internet here at the house wasn't playing so nice. So I'm glad we were able to make today work.
Yeah, the scheduling is so easy with the way you got it set up online. It was, I think it took me 10 seconds to reschedule.
Well, the advantages of modern technology, right?
Exactly.
Well, let's start with, I always ask these get to know you questions. As we were talking off air, I took them out once and then people started complaining. So for you, the listeners, let me ask these get to know you questions so we can get to know Bob a little better. So Bob, coffee or tea?
Coffee, black.
Okay. That is the right answer, though my last 2 guests, and the listeners will know this, have both been iced tea. So I'm happy to hear a fellow coffee drinker again. Do you have a favorite place to drink that coffee?
Anymore, it's at home. Used to when I was working, Starbucks every day, sort of thing. It was the habit, on the way to work and then somewhere in the middle of the day, usually. But now, it's just out of the Keurig, the little K-cups that you buy at Costco, and on my back deck on a beautiful sunny morning. I love that.
That's awesome. And I find that, Yeah, you mentioned the sunny morning and the back deck, and I find that to be typically with coffee drinkers, there is a spot that they enjoy just sitting there and sipping that coffee. So that's great to hear. Do you have a best or worst travel story?
Actually, it's all the same story. You know,
Okay.
all in
As
one
with so
trip.
many things in life, right?
Yeah, all in one trip. I actually had taken a trip to Italy, and I had a flight coming back that was going from Rome to the Netherlands, and it was leaving Rome early in the morning. But I knew once between the Netherlands back to Seattle, that I wanted to sleep on that flight. So I stayed up really late. The flight was leaving really early in the morning, and we get to the Rome airport like 5 o'clock in the morning, maybe 6 o'clock in the morning, something like that. And we get on the plane, but where we're flying into the Netherlands, it's fogged in, so they won't let us depart Rome. So we're sitting on the tarmac for hours, and finally they say, okay, the fog's cleared, we can depart. Well, now we've missed our connecting flight, as did thousands of other people. So you are in this major European hub with thousands of people standing in line trying to reschedule flights. And I'm exhausted because I've only had like 2 hours of sleep.
I'm
And of
sure.
course, all the hotels around the airport are all booked now because everybody's booked a room. It's like, where am I going to stay, till tomorrow's flight, sort of thing. Well, in this line, and literally, I think I've been in line for 4 or 5 hours, but the line for the first class passengers, there's like only 1 or 2 people in it. Well, then my wife decided, you know what, I'm going to go get in that line. And sure enough, they accepted her. She got our tickets rebooked. We found a place to stay for the night, went, got some sleep, come back the next day. And it's a 9-hour flight. And I'm thinking, I don't like to be on the plane any longer than I have to be. And so I'm always the last person on the plane. So I go, finally go to board the plane, and I've got my ticket in hand. And I go to turn right to go to my seat. And they say, oh, no, turn left. You're up in the front of the plane. They had booked us into business class.
Nice.
And for this 9-hour flight, these are the seats that like totally flat. I mean, they're so comfortable, the most comfortable flight I've ever had. So what turned into this nightmare where I had no sleep, didn't know where I was going to stay, spent hours in line. The very next day, oh my gosh, the most luxurious flight I've ever had. Back when I landed in Seattle 9 hours later, I still did not want to get off the plane. It was that comfortable.
That is great. That's a great story. And I think there might be a life lesson in there somewhere too. When things go completely downhill, that something good can happen.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one last question. Do you have a favorite or most meaningful nonfiction book?
Oh gosh. Probably I would say the most influential nonfiction book. Well, let's see, would that be nonfiction? Let me think a second. Yeah, I guess it's nonfiction. It's written by the Arbinger Institute. It's called Leadership and Self-Deception, Getting Out of the Box.
Okay.
As far as my leadership journey, that was probably the most influential book that really changed the way that I looked at leadership. And they've got a prequel to that book also. And Arbinger Institute has actually worked with some law enforcement agencies also and has done some phenomenal work. And so on the early steps of my law enforcement journey, that was probably the most influential book. And I recommend it to everybody. Even the classes I teach, I still recommend that book. And basically what it says is look in the mirror. If you're having leadership issues, maybe you should be looking in the mirror.
That's good advice. I will check that out. And we're going to talk a lot about leadership today, because that's obviously something that not only do you have experience in, but something you're helping with. But let's go ahead and we'll go back just a little bit to kind of your story. You mentioned law enforcement, so I know that's part of it, but I believe you kind of grew up in a law enforcement family as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm second generation law enforcement. My dad retired from the Seattle Police Department, and I got hired by a suburb of Seattle. I didn't go to work for the city of Seattle itself, but in the general area. And I did 34 years there in law enforcement. And I promoted relatively fast. We were a small agency when I hired in, and we grew quickly. So it wasn't so much that I was such a superstar. I was just kind of in the right time at the right place, sort of thing. And so as I promoted, you start on this leadership journey. And I really believe that everybody, they want to be a good leader. That's why you get promoted, because you want to do a good job at whatever job you accept. And the reality of it is we know from, there was a survey done back in like 2013, a Gallup poll. And I think that's the famous one everybody knows, where they said basically 50% of everybody surveyed had quit a bad boss. They say a person doesn't leave a company, they leave a bad boss, sort of thing.
Right.
And there was another survey done by another company in 2017 that had doubled the number of people surveyed, and that number had gone up to 57%. But the thing that was more interesting in that to me was, so the 57% had either quit one or more bad bosses, but another 32% wanted to quit a bad boss. So well over 80% of people, either have or want to quit a bad boss. And when you look at that, you think, well, with all of these best-selling leadership books that we have, how can we be struggling so much with leadership? Well, in my leadership journey, when I first started taking leadership classes back in, probably the late 80s, leadership studies were still relatively new. Academics were still figuring out what is leadership. They were going through trait theory. What traits does a great leader have? And so all of these progressions that we went through. Well, when I first started my leadership classes, they focused on things like planning and organizing, directing and controlling, and they called those leadership classes. But as we well know now, those are management classes.
Right.
Now, I'm a great student. I was a great manager, but a leader, there was a lot of work to be done there, right? But when it came to numbers and systems and that sort of stuff, I was a good manager. But as I progressed, I needed to become a good leader. And that's what I really struggled with. And so I'm doing what most everybody does. I'm reading the best-selling leadership books and trying to take clues from that, applying it to the real life world. And then I started finding other people that I worked with, around the water cooler, the lunchroom sort of thing. And they're reading books and we're sharing ideas on how, we're applying it or how we find it applicable in the real life world. And so then we started a leadership book club. And so we got all the people that were interested, in becoming a better leader, that were interested in promoting. And we would meet after work and we'd pick a book. And then, of course, shift work. Not everybody can make every meeting. So I was keeping a blog on the side so people could keep up to speed with the progress of the club. And I remember, looking back in hindsight, after we'd probably read maybe 10 or 12 leadership books, one of the guys that I worked with is coming into a meeting and he goes, leadership is just relationships. And at the time, I thought that was so profound because it perfectly summarized all the leadership books we had read, because all of those books focused on the interpersonal relationship between the leader and the follower, right, which was definitely one of my weaknesses. That's one of the things I definitely needed to work on. But now, roll the clock ahead a number of years. At age 52, I go back to college. I used tuition reimbursement that the department supplied. Use that tuition reimbursement to get my bachelor's degree and my master's degree in management and leadership. And what I learned is that interpersonal relationship is really important. But what I have figured out that we're missing in leadership is that direction and that vision, in essence, because I had 5 police chiefs over my 34-year career. They were all great people. Everybody loved them. They were very charismatic, but one stood out head and shoulders above everybody else as a fabulous leader. And actually, I should say I had 5.5 chiefs because we had one chief that was fired for dishonesty and we had an interim chief until we hired the next full-time chief, right?
Yeah.
And so when we hired that interim chief, actually we borrowed him from a neighboring agency and he would only come in part-time, 2 or 3 days a week. He'd come in and then he was gone. But so much got done. And I was a brand new lieutenant at the time. And looking back, I wish I would have had more time to spend with him as a leader to figure out how he did it. But what I realized looking back is he would come in and say what he wanted accomplished. And then he'd say, I'll be back next week, get it done. And you'd use your own ingenuity, figure out how to get it done. I mean, how empowering is that?
Right.
And that's that same quote from General George Patton. General George Patton had that quote. He said, basically, don't tell people what to do or tell them how to do things, tell them what you want them to accomplish, and then get out of their way and their ingenuity will amaze you.
Right.
And that's exactly what this guy did. He would come in and say, I want this done, and this done, accomplish this by the time I get back next week. And it got done. And it was so amazing when you look back, things just got done so much more effectively than I had in the previous 7 years that I worked there. And like I said, I wish I had more time with that guy. Now, the chief we hired after that, which is the one that I say stood head and shoulders above everybody else, he was mentored by that guy that we used as the interim chief. So that interim chief was his mentor.
Okay.
Now, when I look back and this one chief that we had that stood up head and shoulders above everybody else, what did he do different? He had a vision of how he was going to change our organization, how he was going to make it better, basically what we aspired to become as an organization. And he got everybody on board with it. We were so proud to be working where we worked. We had, shirts that our logos embroidered on the shirt. We had, sweat gear for working out that had our agency name on the sleeve and down the side of the leg. I mean, everybody was on board with where we were going and what we were creating because he had a vision that says, this is where we are going. The other chiefs I even had one chief say, I just want everybody to get along. There was no direction. It's just answer the 911 calls, solve the cases sort of thing. But there was no direction as far as how we were solving things.
Yeah.
And I had another chief where, as the executive staff, we kept using terms like the squirrel syndrome, because every week there was a new priority, there was a new fire to put out sort of thing.
Always in law enforcement.
Shiny object syndrome, those sorts of things. But when you have somebody that focuses the organization on what they aspire to accomplish or aspire to become as an organization, and people believe in that vision, that's where that intrinsic motivation comes from. That's where people come to work in, because they are contributing to something greater than themselves. They're contributing to something meaningful. And that's what we all want. We all want to contribute to something meaningful. So that's when I look back at that portion of the story, when I look at that chief and why he was so much better, is because of that vision. And I see the same sort of thing with other law enforcement executives that I respect. And there's several of them that I wish I could clone them throughout the industry. Let's take a clone of this guy and put him everywhere, sort of thing. Because they've got that vision, and they are able to get people on board with that vision of what they're creating in the organization. But the interesting thing is, so I teach a 40-hour class, the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, and I co-teach it with a couple other instructors. Yeah. And one of the instructors that I co-teach with, he's got a Venn diagram that he puts up on the screen. And in one of the circles is all the characteristics of a leader. On the other circle is all the characteristics of a manager, and then a few that overlap in the Venn diagram, right? Okay. So the exercises he asks the students, it says, of the best leaders that you've ever worked for, pick some of their characteristics off of these lists, and then let's talk about it. Nobody ever, this has been going on for like 10 plus years. Nobody ever picks vision off of the list because they don't see it mentored in the workplace.
Interesting.
And that's where and especially in law enforcement, that's where we learn our leadership skills, is from those that preceded us. We model our behaviors of those generations before us generally, unless it's really bad. Say, oh, I'm never going to be like that guy. We've all been there, right? Yeah. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon to me, especially in our industry. Although I have found now, working with private sector businesses, that it's not so unique, that vision is kind of a lost concept. But that vision is, when you look at some of the best, whether they're tech leaders or military leaders, when there was a vision and a mission to be accomplished, and they inspired people to that. Even with Steve Jobs from Apple. He had a reputation of what, as I read in a book one time, of verbally eviscerating people for their bad ideas. That's not good interpersonal skills, right?
Not at all.
But he had a vision of what that company was going to create and how they were going to change the world. And people were inspired by that vision. And still to this day, people love working at Apple because they feel they're contributing to something that's changing the world. They're contributing to something meaningful. When we look at law enforcement, there's actually years and years ago, I went to some leadership training in Las Vegas. The instructor was from an organization in Florida. And I remember him saying to this day that when he first got hired and he was going to go to the academy, he called his uncle, who was a judge in Florida. He was so proud, I got hired, I'm going to be a police officer. And his uncle, the judge, told him, he said, if you do this job properly, there's nothing ever you will do that's more noble with your life. Nothing more noble that you will do with your life. Right. But the key is if you do the job properly. So when we think about what we do in law enforcement, the service that we provide, to the community, the nobility of that is amazing. What we're contributing to, the intrinsic motivation of why we do what we do is what inspires people, to stick it out, even through some of the worst times that we've gone through lately. Right. But sometimes we lose track of that. And that's where it's really important, I think, with our civilian staff, our record staff, that maybe they're doing data entry all day or something like that. And it's, I could see that would seem really boring, but the reality of it is the organization couldn't exist without them. Right. We couldn't do our mission without them. And so we need to make sure we keep them connected to that idea. There's and I don't know if this is a real story or if it's just urban legend, but in the leadership circles, there's a story of when President Kennedy had basically challenged the country to put a man on the moon. And so during this process, as NASA's developing new metals and stuff, because we didn't even have the metals that it took to get a man to the moon hadn't even been invented yet. So this was quite the challenge, right? Right. So the story goes that President Kennedy went down to NASA to visit the NASA Space Center. And as he's walking around, he comes across this employee and he happens to ask the gentleman, says, so what do you do here at NASA? And the man stood up proudly, he's speaking to the President of the United States, and he goes, Mr. President, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. Well, person's job title was janitor. So he's
Awesome.
not sitting at the pointy end of the rock and he's not pushing the launch button, but he understands his contribution of keeping the workplace clean and safe and orderly is just as important as everything else. And that's where in my classes, I use the example of our organizations are like the internal workings of a clock. And the mission of a clock is to display the time of day. But when you turn it over and open it up, every cog and wheel and spring has a different function. And if any one of those cogs, wheels, or springs doesn't do its function, the whole machine comes to a grinding halt. Right. And that's where, as managers and as leaders, we've got to keep our people that have some of the more mundane tasks, or what seem to be the more mundane tasks, engaged into the importance of what they're contributing to. Is that, they may not be out on the street putting handcuffs on people or making the community safer for people, but what they're doing is vital, because it wouldn't be in our budget. It wouldn't be on the payroll if it wasn't vitally important, because somebody in management somewhere had to make a sales pitch to either your city or county council. We need this position to survive, to get it funded forever. Employee salaries are in your budget forever, unless you have to go through budget cuts and layoffs.
Right.
And so that's a huge commitment. So somebody had to do a sales pitch. We absolutely need this position. As managers and leaders, we can't lose track of that with the people that have some of what we would consider some of the more mundane jobs.
That is so important, and something that, like you said, I think gets lost. I've even seen it where sometimes they lose that importance and that focus with positions we all would argue are extremely important, such as frontline patrol and so forth. I mean, sometimes at agencies, the focus becomes more the investigative positions or SWAT positions, tactical positions, and so forth, which are all vitally important. And we seem to lose that focus that without patrol, you're not a law enforcement agency, no matter where you're at.
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. Well, it's interesting because not so much lately, but I'd say, 3 to 8 years ago, while I'm teaching my classes, one of the biggest complaints that I would hear from the middle managers as they're coming up, they're going, oh, these darn millennials, that they're not even off probation yet. And they want to know, when do I get to go to SWAT? When do I get to go to CSI and all the high action stuff, right? And so I started showing them their recruitment videos. Like, what are you advertising?
Exactly.
You're showing
K9 and tactical.
Yeah, exactly. SWAT, motorcycles, repelling out of helicopters, all that stuff. You're doing the bait and switch. Oh, you don't get to do any of that for another 10 years.
Yeah, you got a lot of reports to write between here and there. No, that's so true. Now, just for context, so everyone can kind of understand your experience, during your career, you were able to go from pretty much line supervision on up to an executive position. Is that my understanding why you were there?
Yeah. Yeah, I retired as a police captain. I did 34 years, and 80% of my career was supervision and higher. At year 4, I promoted to first level supervision. Year 7, I promoted to lieutenant, and shortly thereafter to captain. And that's where I ended my career, was at captain. Okay. In my agency, when I first hired in, I was officer number 8.
Wow.
And now we have over 100 officers. So there was a lot of rapid growth. Of course, when I hired in, the only computer we had was the dumb terminal that connected to the state crime information center. Yep. The green monochrome screen. Everything else was typewriters and handwritten, sort of stuff. So I was very instrumental moving into the computer age. I used to do budget spreadsheets in Lotus 1-2-3 and DOS. And thank goodness Windows came along, that graphical user interface, and just the progression there of, we used to contract out for computer services, on our network. And then, we grew enough that basically we were able to bring in-house IT staff, that sort of thing, get an in-house prosecutor. I mean, all those growth issues that we went through, we went from serving a population of 6,000 to a population of 40,000. So, huge growth. Yeah, and, and with that, it's the leadership demand was the critical part. And especially for me, because like I say, I had a nickname because I was, like I said, I was so management driven and I was so numbers driven. They used to refer to me as Robo Bob, And so as a captain, I had to figure out, how do I get rid of this numbers driven reputation and to be more of a leader that inspires people. And actually that's my motto: lead, teach, and inspire.
Right.
And
which I love that motto, by the way.
Provide the direction, and so I've got these 3 responsibilities that I refer to as kind of the initial step to leadership. I call it how to be a better boss, but they also relate to leadership. And then we can get into the leadership aspect. But as far as being a better boss, there's 3 responsibilities that come with every promotion. whether it's first level supervision, middle management, or the executive level. And the first responsibility is to start focusing on outcomes. Now, we know in our industry, and I've seen it in the private sector as well, the people that are really great technicians, they're the ones that get promoted, because they do that job so well. And then they get promoted and they're still in that technician mode. They haven't made the transition to that manager leader mode yet. And so they're still telling people, in essence, I use the term carpenter because everybody can relate to it. They're telling the carpenter how many holes to drill and how many nails to hammer. Rather than, oh, I'm the supervisor now, build me a wall or build me a home, get out of their way and let their ingenuity amaze you, right?
Right.
And so.
And in some cases, it's not even, just playing off that analogy real quick, it's not even so much telling them how many holes and stuff. Sometimes they have the hammer and nail in their hand. And it's like, no, you need to step away for a moment. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, exactly. Step aside. I'll handle this one,
Exactly.
Sort of thing. Yeah, exactly. So you've got to get out of that mindset and start focusing on results. So, and that's applicable at the first level supervisory level, middle management. So at the first level supervision, you're responsible for the outcomes or outputs of your team or your squad. Middle management, you're responsible for the outcomes or outputs of a division, maybe multiple divisions. And then at the executive level, you're responsible for the outcomes of the entire organization. And that's where, you start focusing, you get away from that technician. And I see it a lot. It's, as we promoted through the ranks and, now we've been up in the executive level, we're in the white ivory tower, for so long, we still think we know how things are done on the street. And let me tell you, if you've been off the street for a period of time, trust me, things are different. And I use a phrase I call the 12-foot rule. And that if you have a problem somewhere, the person within 12 feet of the problem should be involved in solving that problem because they know that problem better than anybody. And so if I think I'm in the ivory tower, oh, I did that 20 years ago, here's the answer, and I send it down the line, probably not going to be the best solution. Plus, it doesn't create any engagement. And then when it does get to the line, they're going, what the heck is he thinking? This isn't going to work, sort of thing. And so you got to utilize that 12-foot rule. The second responsibility that I talk about is facilitating the success of your people. And that is such a huge, you got to make sure they've got the knowledge, skills, and ability. So when you tell them, build me a wall, you've got to make sure they got the right tools, that they've been trained properly on how to do it. They've got all the tools that they need so that you can step back and allow them to use their ingenuity. And then the third responsibility is to safeguard their welfare. Make sure they've got a safe environment, make sure that they've got the proper safety equipment and so on, because we want them to go home to their families at night. And just doing those three things, because there was a gentleman from one of my neighborhood agencies. He used to teach classes at the academy to clerical staff for years and years and years. And every time he did a class, he did a survey and he asked the employees, what are the top 2 complaints about your organization? Now, this is not a scientific survey or anything like this, but he did it for a long period of time. And after a period of time, he said, I can categorize 80% of the complaints into 2 categories. That's micromanagement and lack of direction.
Yep.
Well, we've already talked about those 2. That micromanagement, step back, let the people do the work, focus on the results, right?
Yep.
And then lack of direction, that's that vision thing. What do we aspire to accomplish? Where are we going? What are we trying to do? And one of the exercises that I use that your listeners can use as a quick test is in my classes, I will ask, and in my classes, I usually have middle managers all the way up to chiefs and sheriffs. And I will ask them to list on a piece of paper, what are the top 3 to 5 priorities of your organization? And literally, I've had 2 captains from the same organization sitting next to each other, and there's a brief pause. They look at each other and they bust out laughing because they know they're not going to write down the same answer.
Wow.
And generally, when I ask that question, 95% of the time, it's a deer in the headlights. What do you mean our top 3 to 5 priorities? Well, what that tells me is that the direction, if executive level is providing direction, it's not getting down the line.
Yep.
One of the other examples you can use is one that I did. When I first got assigned to patrol operations, I went to the patrol sergeants that I was responsible for. Oh, and let me stop there a second. You notice I said people that I'm responsible for.
Yes.
In our industry, and again, I see it a lot in the private sector now also, people go, oh, I'm in charge of this. I'm in charge of investigations, or I'm in charge of patrol operations. These are adults. They have free will, and they will not hesitate to quit, go somewhere else, transfer or whatever. You are responsible for their outcomes, what they do. You're responsible for their welfare and their safety, and you're responsible for their success. And that's why I use those 3 responsibilities. So if we start changing our mindset of oh, I'm in charge. No, I'm responsible for your success. I'm responsible for the outcomes of this unit or this division or this organization.
Yeah.
We start looking at these are my responsibilities. And that's where I hope what I really want to inspire in people is, especially if you're in middle management and above, and you get that phone call in the middle of the night, and maybe one of your officers got their tail in a ringer or some incidents going on, that I hope that your first thought to yourself is, what is my culpability in this? What could I have done, or what should I have done that could have prevented this from happening to my officer?
Yes.
My officer getting their tail in a ringer. And I'll be honest with you. Used to the videos that we would see on television, mostly the news. So it's just a snippet, and cops would always say, oh, you're not seeing the full picture. Granted, that is true. But now we are seeing more and more of the full picture from body cams that are being released through public records and then put on YouTube. So we are getting the fuller picture. The vast majority of times where I see that officers entered into what I call career-ending behaviors, the vast majority of time, I blame it on the organization. What I see is the organization letting the officer down. That behavior could have been prevented, or it could have, there were clues, red flag warnings that a supervisor or a manager should have recognized that it could have intervened before this officer engaged in this career-ending behavior. And that's the vast majority of those that I see. Now, of course, there's the exceptions to the rule, but let's take the worst case scenario. Shoot, his name's escaping me now. The George Floyd, Derek Chauvin.
Yep.
Yeah. So Derek Chauvin, the very first time I saw that video with his knee on George Floyd's neck, I thought to myself, that's not the first time he's done that.
Right.
And as I found out later, it was true. There were 18 other people that came forward with complaints of him doing a similar thing to them. Those are the 18 that we know of. Those are the 18 that came forward. Now, this is also an officer that's a field training officer.
Right.
So now we get into my section of my class, ethical decision making, and how are young officers learning how law enforcement is done. So, and one of those officers at that event, the George Floyd event, was a student officer fresh out of the academy, and there were some other young officers too. So this young officer is learning, this is how we do law enforcement in Minneapolis. No, it's not. But the organization allowed that behavior to continue. And this is what I will tell first line supervisors, middle managers, and executives, is that if you resist having the crucial conversations with your people, because interpersonal conflict is difficult. We would like to avoid interpersonal conflict with our staff. If we can, we might put it off or something like that. That we can't do that. Our responsibility is to make sure that we're holding people accountable, because if there's a behavior that's maybe in a little bit of a gray area and we don't address it, and then that behavior gets repeated, once it gets repeated, that's now your culture.
Yes.
You have allowed that to morph your culture. And so when you see these little things, these little red flags, you've got to get onto them. Otherwise, this may totally snowball out of control, and you're going to get, horrendous incidents like that. But there's also so many red flag warnings to watch for in the workplace. We've probably all seen the officer that has their mail distribution boxes full of follow-ups that are delinquent, that have been there forever. Maybe now, body cam videos that haven't been logged properly, this sort of thing. Oh, because they're just too busy. They got other stuff going on. Well, when we talk about motivating employees, and sometimes you say, well, employees just aren't motivated to work. Well, these are examples of employees that are motivated, just not in the way that we want. They're off doing their thing. Oh, I don't have time to log that evidence, or I don't have time to, log that body cam video, that sort of stuff. I don't have time to do that follow-up because I'm out here doing this other stuff. As supervisors and managers, those are red flags because they're not following our guidelines. What else are they doing that doesn't follow our guidelines? And there is another, very famous, well, I should say more of a viral body cam video of an officer in Florida that basically got fired. He thought he was doing good work. He's getting guns and drugs off the street, but he's violating people's civil rights at the same time. Right. But the problem is, related back to what I was just talking about, is the other officers they interviewed that had seen him do this several times, they go, I just thought that was okay, what he was doing, because he's been doing it so many times. So they're figuring that even though it's a violation of department policy, a violation of state law, they're thinking, oh, well, this must be okay because he's doing it and he's doing it over and over and over again. And again, that's those behaviors that create your culture, because our younger officers, they're still trying to figure out this career. So they're looking up and they're looking around in the organization for clues on how they should behave.
Yep.
And that's where we have to make sure that we're providing that right guidance. But I'll take up the whole hour on this, so you need to stop me.
Well, I think it's absolutely great
about this stuff.
I think it's wonderful. I really do, Bob. And in fact, I want to make sure the listeners check out. I'm going to have a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes, so definitely check that out. But a lot of where you were just talking about is in this great article you wrote, Career-Ending Police Misconduct and Massive Lawsuit Settlements, Mostly Preventable. Great article. I really enjoyed it. And a lot of what you just talked about, how big, like you talk about this whole thing with ethical decision-making. Is this something where agencies are not teaching that to? So in my case, and I don't go into a lot of specifics on where I work and so forth on this podcast, but I am very blessed to be at a very forward-thinking agency. So we actually have not only have we had multiple classes on things like that, we have an actual ethical decision-making card that sits above my visor in my car. So I'm very fortunate to work at an agency that has a vision and so forth. So when I hear some of these horror stories from across the country, and I say that, and yet no agency, even the most forward thinking, is immune from some of these stories that we hear as far as things going bad. What I think is the difference is how quickly it's dealt with, and the fact that it doesn't happen again, as opposed to, like you said, behavior that's tolerated gets repeated. So when it comes to ethical decision making, is that something where agencies are really failing their officers? And then if so, what is the steps that line supervisor, so that sergeant that's listening, that lieutenant that's listening, what are the things that they can start doing to make that change within their span of control?
I think the easiest thing that supervisors, sergeants and lieutenants can do, let me add this before I go to that step. As lieutenants, as captains, sit in a roll call occasionally.
Yes.
I made it a rule every Friday morning. We're on 12-hour shifts, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. I was responsible for day shift. I had another captain colleague that was responsible for night shift. So every Friday morning shift briefing at 6 a.m., I was there. And it was so funny because at first, everybody's like, on edge, the captain's in the room, sort of thing. And the sergeant would stop his briefing like, oh, captain, is there something you want to add? No, I'm just a fly on the wall. It's still your briefing, take it away. And it got to the point where then it was just the norm.
Yep.
And then even if questions would come up during the week, say, well, hang that onto that question until Friday. The captain will be here on Friday. And we'll ask him when he gets here. So it became the norm. And I learned so much about what was going on the street. And so I would say, make yourself available to your people, however you do it, and do it on a regular recurring schedule so that they can count on you being there. Now, back to your original question on this ethical decision-making, what we can do as supervisors and as middle managers. I think the quickest and easiest thing, and this really only takes a couple of minutes, is when we see some of these body cam videos that were career-ending behaviors for officers, and our first reaction might be, nobody in my agency would ever do that.
Yeah.
Take that video and talk about it. You might be surprised. And I'll give you a couple examples. One was several years ago, I was at a shift briefing, and like I said, we did huge growth. We were hiring people as fast as we could hire them from all over the country. And just by accident, I brought up the subject of felony stops and how we conduct a felony stop. And when we found just on this one patrol squad alone, there were 3 different philosophies on how to do felony stops. Well, I'm glad we figured it out in the shift briefing room rather than out on the street, because they were 3 distinctly different techniques that came in from all over the country. And I'm guessing that in our lateral training that they get through the state academy, that apparently felony stops aren't covered, so that we're doing them uniformly. But that was something we had to fix right away, because this could be tragic out on the street.
Right.
So I would say, take these videos and just show them. Don't cast any judgment, and ask your people, what do you think of that? And one of the reasons that I say that is I mentioned it in that article, is there was a video that I saw from just a couple of years ago where a suspect had basically submitted to the officer, lying down on the ground, arms spread out. He's following all the commands. And then before the officer comes up to handcuff him, he comes up and he kicks him in the side of the head like he's kicking an extra point for an American football game. I mean, really hard in the side of the head. And then he comes around and handcuffs him. My first reaction, if I were to see that video, is, nobody in my organization would ever do that. But then I find another video of the exact same thing in a completely different part of the country.
Right.
And another video, and as you saw in the article, I found 12 of them doing exactly. I'm going, where are people getting this idea to kick somebody in the head? And maybe, I don't know, maybe there's some defensive tactics training by private fighters or something where they're teaching this as like, this is as effective as a stun grenade or something. I don't know. I don't know where this comes from, but this would be worth having the conversation with our people. What do you think of this? And maybe some of them, oh yeah, they were training, that. Yeah, no, we're not going to do that. I don't care who was training.
We don't do that.
And when you watch some of these videos, some of these officers got fired immediately. And then other officers got disciplined. I think one even got reduced in rank because he didn't report the use of force, sort of thing. And so these are very short videos to show, what do you think of this sort of thing? It just makes sure that everybody's in the same sheet of music, like we were talking about with the felony stops. And to me, that can be so easy to do, and you might get surprised.
Yes. Well, and like you just said, with the one that got disciplined for not reporting it, I mean, that's becoming as big of a hot button issue now in light of the George Floyd incident or killing, but also like you're seeing it with like the ABLE training and so forth that's coming out now, the active bystandership training, to where if you're there observing this happen, you are just as culpable as the guy that is physically doing whatever the action may be, even if you're not his direct supervisor, or especially if you're not his direct supervisor.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I saw a video that made me recognize a shortcoming in our training. And, our new recruits, we're teaching them to intervene. That, if an officer has let their emotions get the better of them and they're going to engage in an excessive use of force, is to intervene on that excessive use of force, right?
Yep.
So there was a video recently where basically a sergeant was preparing to pepper spray a suspect in the back of a patrol car who was handcuffed. And the brand new officer, fresh out of the academy, she sees this, she's been trained to intervene, and she grabs the sergeant by his belt from behind and pulls him back away from the car. And his immediate reaction was to turn around and grab her by the throat and back her up against the car. Of course, the audio was muted, so we don't know exactly what the exchange was, but you could tell it wasn't very friendly. And that was career-ending behavior for that sergeant.
Yeah. And he ended up being criminally charged on it as well. That happened down here in Florida.
Okay. And so what I realized from that is, yeah, we're teaching our young officers to intervene. Have we had any discussions with our senior officers what that might feel like? And what's the intent? In essence, I'm trying to save your job. You don't need to turn around and choke me, sort of thing. But that would be a good 5-minute conversation to have.
Yeah.
So when that does happen, and that's when I saw that video, I thought, wow, we are failing our people by not having this discussion.
So correct.
Yeah. So anyway, those are the sorts of things that I think as a first level supervisor on this ethical decision making, because I do a section in my classes on ethical decision making where we talk about consequentialism and basically what creates the net benefit versus the net harm sort of thing, deontological consequences, all the way down to virtue ethics approach. And that's great for an executive, especially if they're going to make a disciplinary decision, because they can go through all of these different criteria and then come to their decision. And then they've got this criteria that makes their decision defensible. Yeah. So of all the things that I considered, this is my decision, rather than, oh, it just felt like the right thing to do. And so it can help you make a better decision, but that takes time. And our cops on the street don't have that kind of time. Right. So where we can help our cops on the street is to have these shift briefing discussions with these videos, because in essence, I refer to them as like football practice. Because we've already talked about this type of scenario. So when it does come up and a decision needs to be made right now, it's already been rehearsed in the shift briefing room, and they know what the appropriate response is. They don't have to make it up on the fly.
That is absolutely correct. And it's very powerful. And I was very fortunate years ago. I had a lieutenant who he made it his point, and sometimes it was ethical related, and other times it was just law enforcement related. And he would just throw out random scenarios at every briefing. It would be, if something happens at this Walmart, at this location, and this is the scenario, what do you do? And just go around, and what do you do? You're driving by, you were going to stop by the gas station to get a drink, and you do what? And that, because you know how it is. If you throw a question out as an instructor, nobody's going to raise their hand. And if you ask somebody, they're going to give you the shortest answer possible, usually, because they want you to go on to the next guy. And that's if anyone's even in the front of the classroom, because if it's good law enforcement training, everybody's way in the back. It's like a Baptist church. Everybody sits in the back row. So that is so powerful, because in that environment, everybody's discussing it and you are kind of put on the spot, but in that small read off environment, it's just part of it, and it becomes a discussion, and in some ways kind of becomes a tabletop exercise that makes a big difference if and when an event like that happens, because even your newest deputy, newest officer knows how to act or react.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and it's funny that you mentioned that, because back in the old days when I was a first level supervisor, our patrol shifts, we used to rotate every 3 months from day swing to graveyard. And so when we were in graveyard, we had pre-planned response routes to bank robberies. And we used to rehearse these on graveyard. So I was the only sergeant that was doing it at the time. And so we would go out and we would talk about not only where are you supposed to be stationed, but let's look at your background. If you were engaged in a firefight, what's your background here? You know, and to pre-think about these things before you're in the heat of the moment and needing to pull the trigger, is that we know, okay, there's a brick wall, that'd be a safe background. Whoop, there's a main intersection full of cars, probably don't want to fire that direction. You know, so we're given the rehearsal, in essence, the football practice. You know, and I still have guys that I worked with that are, you know, we're all now in retirement, and they're going, you know, those were some of the best exercises and so on, and they really appreciated that fact. And I kind of got that from my dad, you know, because as a Seattle police officer, they used to, he was in the motorcycle unit, and he and his motorcycle buddies at coffee, they would talk about who could come up with the greatest plan to take over the city. And then, you know, me as the active gunman, you know, taking over the city, how are you going to get to me, you know, sort of thing. So that's kind of where I got the idea. I just made a more practical application of it.
I think it's great. And I tell you, like you said, those are some of the best stories and some of the best memories I have, is that kind of training. And then I can also relate it to actual incidents that have happened and when that training became invaluable. Let me ask you one other quick question. When we talk about traits of a leader, and I really like what you talk about with these two traits. So what do you believe as far as when it comes to traits like empathy and vulnerability and how they play a role in leadership?
Well, well, if there's a colleague of mine that she's now the chief down in Albany, Oregon, and if she's listening to this podcast, she's going to be laughing right now, because she's a big Brene Brown fan, and Brene Brown's book, Dare to Lead. Yep. And she mentions in that book that leadership is about vulnerability and empathy and so on. And again, to me, that's the interpersonal part. That's not my strength. That's definitely things I had to work on. I got better at it, you know, over my career. But every boss I had, all 5 of my chiefs, they were great at that. People loved them. They were vulnerable. They were empathetic. I mean, charismatic. You know, they had all the interpersonal characteristics, but they were missing that component of leading. You know, that it wasn't the shiny object syndrome, that it wasn't the squirrel syndrome. We knew what we were trying to accomplish, you know, where we were going. And so you have to have the interpersonal part. But to me, if you have the interpersonal part and you're not leading, if you don't have the vision, you're not providing direction, then you're just a really nice person. You know. Right. And so what the example that I use is if you're the captain of a battleship, and you're in the wheelhouse and you've got your hand on the wheel and you never change course, you're just along for the ride. You know, somebody that's setting the course, plotting a new course, this is where we're going, this is what our mission is. That's a leader that sets, this is the direction we're going. That's why they've got the 40,000 foot view. They can see, you know, the internal and external environment, say, this is where we need to be going. So yeah, when we talk about vulnerability and empathy, it's important because it comes with trust. And once you have trust with your people, that's when they will support you with their blood, sweat, and tears. And the reason that I say that, we probably all had the boss in the past where some citizen might call to complain about a traffic stop or something like that. And their first enter, then the boss comes to you and say, why did you screw this up? Or tell me more about how you screwed this up, sort of thing. The default position is you screwed up, right? Well, as I mentioned, you know, my colleague and I, when we were assigned to patrol operations, we were inclined to change that. And in essence, we always gave our people the benefit of the doubt. If we got a citizen complaint, okay, I've got this data. I've made no judgment on it whatsoever. So, you know, go talk to the officer. Tell me, you know, what you saw, what you did, you know, what your interactions were, and then make the decision. But we would tell our people, our default position is that you did the right thing because we've trained you. We facilitate your success, and we anticipate that you're going to do the right thing. And so that's going to be our default position. And then ultimately you let the facts, the investigation go where it may, but we never started off with the idea that you screwed up. But once we got to the point where that became the norm, people trusted that we had their back. And it was merely just the fact that we gave them the benefit of the doubt. because our responsibility is to facilitate their success, to make sure that they've got the training, the skills and ability to be successful. We anticipate they're going to be successful, and then again, if it goes sideways, what's my culpability in that? Where did I let this officer down? What could I have done or should I have done to prevent this from occurring? And even I'll give you an example that, I think I even mentioned in the article that you're talking about. So in our organization, we had a pursuit policy that we didn't pursue for property crimes, which you want to go back in stories. Let me tell you, when I first started in law enforcement in 1984, one of the real popular property crimes that would happen on a graveyard shift was theft of a car stereo. And I think there were even 8 tracks at the time. I don't even think we were up to 8 cassette players yet.
Wow.
We would literally get into a high-speed pursuit in the middle of the night over a stolen car stereo. Yeah. In hindsight, how stupid was that?
Right. The liability to everybody.
Oh my gosh. Not only the risk to the officer and the suspect, but if I don't know, down in Florida, how they do it, but even still here in the greater Seattle area, we've got newspaper delivery people that are on the streets 3, 4, 5 a.m. and they're just doing their daily route when there's virtually no traffic on the road. And they're on both sides of the road sort of thing. And they come up to an intersection. And when they look to the left and look to the right, they're looking for a car coming roughly close to the speed limit, not at 100 miles an hour. Yep. And then they pull out and get T-boned by the 100-mile-an-hour car over a stolen car stereo. I mean, looking back, hindsight, obviously we're way smarter today than we were then, right? So we think we're smarter. Our department policy was we don't pursue over property crimes. And so one night we had an officer that was pursuing a stolen vehicle going up the freeway, and he called out all the information he's supposed to call out, and his sergeant did the right thing and terminated the pursuit. The officer did what he's supposed to do. He shuts everything down, resumes a normal speed. Well, now he's on a position of the freeway where he has to go quite a ways before he can get to an off ramp and get turned around. And then by the time he does get to that off ramp, he's sitting at the red light waiting to turn left to make the turn to come back around back into town. Gas station on the corner, there's the suspect vehicle. And now he's stopped at a gas pump, So the officer pulls in behind him and there's a car in front of him. So now the suspect's kind of blocked in. And now the suspect looks back, oh, the cops are behind me. Puts in reverse, rams the patrol car to push it back to get enough gap to get out, drives out over the landscaping, back onto the freeway. North they go into the city of Everett. And this is late at night on a summer night, clear summer night, low amount of traffic. But now it's no longer a property crime. According to the officer, he tried to kill me. Right. And we can have the debate about that. And maybe we should start having the debate about that, because one of the people that I teach with, former LAPD, he said, in my day, they used to teach us to jump out of the way of cars, because people were trying to run over us, but they weren't trying to run over us. They're trying to get away from us, And right. He goes, we actually did training where we'd jump out of the way, onto a mat or something like that, I thought, maybe we should have discussions about that at least. But anyway, I get sidetracked here. So anyway, now the pursuit continues on up the freeway, up Interstate 5 into Everett, goes off onto one of their main arterials. And as it approaches Providence Hospital, they're at shift change. And one of the nurses that just got off at midnight, she's on her way home. She's got a green light. And this pickup truck that's being pursued by us T-bones her and kills her. Wow. The absolute thing we did not want to happen. That's why our pursuit policy said we don't want people to die over property crimes. So the intent of what we expected from the executive level by issuing this policy, the results or the outcomes we wanted, we didn't get. Yeah. So now we need to start looking at ourselves. Do we need to communicate the policy differently? Is the policy understood correctly, what the intent that we don't want people to die over property crimes, sort of thing. And should we be evaluating, did the person really try to kill us or were they merely trying to get away? Right. So that should we be training on the extenuating circumstances in essence? So roll the clock forward. Now we're into actually it was late last year, late 2021. I retired in 2018. 2021, I'm doing research for my block of instruction on ethical decision making. And I see this headline where my organization paid out $3 million to the families for the wrongful death of this nurse. Yeah. Now, my personal opinion, I think for losing a wife, losing a mother of 2 children, $3,000 is not enough compensation. But ultimately, that $3 million is intended to change our behavior. And looking back, when I saw that headline, I was so upset because I was part of the executive team. I didn't know we even paid out $3 million. I know our chief knew because she gets a report from the insurance authority, of everything they pay out on. But it never got communicated to us that we paid out money on that claim, and nor did we do anything different. We didn't do training nothing in our organizational behavior changed at all. So that $3 million to us was meaningless, and that woman's death to us was meaningless. And I find that completely inexcusable. Yeah. And that's where when we look at the responsibility, and that's where in the classes that I teach, this leadership component, this holding people accountable and making sure that what we intend for outcomes, that we're getting the outcomes, is so vital, because the consequences can be tragic. I mean, we lose officers, suspects get killed, innocent people get killed. I mean, life and death based off of the decisions that we make. And so when we focus on the outcomes, and so when we issue a policy, we are issuing the policy for a certain purpose. We are expecting a certain outcome. If we're not getting that outcome, then we need to analyze why. What do we need to do different in either how we train on the policy or whatever? We need to be doing something different because we're not getting the outcome we want. And that's our number one responsibility, is to focus on outcomes. And so that's where I challenge my students, is to one, understand the importance of what you do from the first level of supervision all the way up, because people's lives are in the balance. And actually, this is the very first time ever I've been able to talk about that nurse that got killed that night without choking up and getting teary-eyed. So obviously I've talked about it a lot, and this is the very first time that I haven't got teary-eyed about it. So I'm and I wasn't even involved. Yeah. But the idea in my mind, knowing that 2 children lost their mother, that a man lost their wife, and all she was doing was coming home from work. And more importantly, that we did nothing to change our behavior. So it's to me, it's like, if you go to the gun range and you hold up your gun and you line up the sights and you squeeze that trigger and you've got your sights properly lined, you're doing all the mechanics properly to hit the bullseye. If you pull the trigger and then walk away, well, I did everything right, I know I must have hit the bullseye, right? Right. Well, that's why we pull the target back and look at it. Did we? Exactly. Well, the same thing with the policy. Our intent was that people don't get killed over property crimes. We didn't hit the bullseye on that. So we needed to do something different. And when you pull the target back and say, wow, I hit the 7 ring. Okay, I start making some adjustments in the mechanics of how I do things to be able to hit the bullseye. Same thing with issuing the policy. We need that feedback. And are we getting the results that we want? In this case, we didn't. We paid out $3 million and we still didn't do anything different. We didn't change the mechanics whatsoever. To me, that is completely unacceptable for our industry.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And the power of that. And that's what I really loved about the article that you wrote, the career ending police misconduct, and how so much of it is preventable. So I will definitely link that up. I suggest to the listeners, anyone in any sort of leadership position from a corporal and above, definitely take a look at this article, because what Bob's describing here is just so important. 2 last questions for you, sir, because I know we got to get going. Tell us a little bit about what you are doing with toptierleadershiptraining.com, and just what are you doing right now, and how can people connect with that?
Okay. Well, so, obviously during COVID, I've been teaching all my classes online, in a virtual setting. I still have a contract with the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, where I teach the class is called Middle Management. I actually refer to most of what I teach as preparation for executive level. I focus a lot on vision statements, mission statements, strategic planning, that sort of thing. But I also focus on theories of motivations. So like for your online view. So in theories of motivation, I teach these 6 theories of motivation: expectancy theory, needs theory, outcomes, goal setting theory, equity theory, and psychological empowerment. And the reason that I teach those is because they're so vitally important to what motivates people in the workplace and how they choose their behaviors. So, and we're rapidly running out of time, but particularly needs theory. People are doing their behaviors because they're fulfilling some sort of need. You might remember the old days with the Dr. Phil show. He'd have people on his stage and he was going, so what are you getting out of that behavior? And they're like, well, what do you mean? He goes, you wouldn't be doing that behavior if you weren't getting something out of it. In essence, that you're fulfilling some sort of need. Right. The idea is to figure out what is that need. And so that's why I talk about needs theory, because, people are doing, like I say, they're motivated. They just not maybe motivated in the direction that we want.
Yeah.
So we've got to understand what need they're fulfilling when they're doing their sort of thing. Talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And equity theory. Oh my gosh, equity theory will kill morale in an organization faster than anything. So those are important to understand. So when we talk about leadership, I have all these subcomponents. They're so important to understand, from theories of motivation, the ethical decision making, systems. We all have systems in our organizations that we created, and of course, if we are the one person that created it, we think it's the greatest system in the world.
Of course.
You've got employees going, "Why do we do this?" And we don't have a good answer. That's a red flag. Maybe we should research this a little bit. Or people that are going, "This is stupid. This sucks." This sort of thing. Those are all red flags. And either there's information that we could give them, then they would have said, "Oh, okay, now I understand why we do this. Now I understand the bigger picture." Or maybe we don't need to be doing this anymore, or maybe we should be doing it differently. And the employees that are stuck doing it, that think that this is stupid, this is a waste of time, that just pulls morale down, that pulls motivation down, and that creates a disconnect between management and the line workers. So it's important to understand all of these issues. So these are the types of things that I train on. But what I'm focusing on in my training is to be the leader that creates a successful organization and creates successful people in your organization. Because people come to work for us because they are driven by a passion of what we do. We don't have people that want to be architects that come to be police officers. They have an innate drive that they want to serve the public. They want to give to the community. They want to make things better. They want to contribute to something bigger than themselves, something that's meaningful. And when we can create an organization, we can do amazing things. I also do, just when I do some local talks occasionally with different businesses, I did a talk not too long ago called Coffee with an Expert. And I just started off with, is it the responsibility of the employee to come to work for us already motivated to put in a good day's work? Or is it the employer's responsibility to create an environment that stimulates motivation? And we were scheduled for, I think, for an hour and a half. We went 2.5 hours and had to cut it off. I said, okay, we'll have to get back to work now,
Right.
Because it was such an interesting discussion. So even just the theories of motivation, we can really get into details on that. But what I focus on is basically preparing middle managers to become executives and to help executives be better at what they do.
That's great. And I really love what you're doing, and it is so needed. And even as we've talked, story after story after story keeps coming to mind. And it's kind of funny how you have these conversations, especially in the law enforcement space, and you can think of that sergeant or that lieutenant at both good and bad examples of all the above. So I really love it. Let me ask you my one final question that I kind of ask everybody who comes on here. We've been through so many great things that does make a difference for everybody. But if we're going to boil it down or have something different, what is the one takeaway, the one thing that law enforcement officers can do that's going to make a difference in their personal lives? Something actionable that they can do right now.
That'll make a difference in their personal lives?
Yes.
I'm not good at pop quizzes, but what would come to my mind, because when you talk about work and life balance, I think if we focus on treating all people with dignity and respect, whether that's people in our private life, whether that's people in our families, people in our families who maybe have a different belief than we have about law enforcement or other things, and of course the people we deal with on the job. If we keep that as a main focus of treating people with dignity and respect, and recognizing that we can't truly understand a person until we've walked a mile in their shoes. And I could go on again another hour or two about that discussion alone. Things that I learned personally, some of my own shortcomings where I made assumptions about people, assuming they were making bad decisions, where in reality there were things that were way beyond their control that led to this stage of their life. I think that would probably be the one thing, is just focus on, in the workplace and at home, treating everybody you encounter with dignity and respect. And gosh, I had another thing that just tailed onto that, and the thought is just eluding me right now. And it was really good. I wish I could remember it now. Darn.
It happens to all of us. No problem at all. Well, Bob, I really appreciate it. For the listeners, make sure you check out toptierleadershiptraining.com, toptierleadershiptraining.com. There'll be a link, of course, in the show notes to that. I really appreciate it, Bob. Anything that maybe I haven't asked you that we want to make sure the listeners know before I let you go?
No, the only thing that I would add for your listeners is that I am completely open. I would love invitations if you have an association meeting where maybe you want somebody to speak, even 1 hour at a luncheon about leadership or theories of motivation, that sort of thing. Or if you've got an organization that's maybe region wide or something like that, I would love to speak. Or even if your organization has a site that they would like to host my training and get a couple of free seats, and then we'll let everybody else pay your fee for coming in, the typical training sort of stuff. But I focus on what I like to call executive level training, basically preparing people, for that higher level in the organization, providing direction to the organization, and ultimately overall just making things better, and ultimately getting to the point where when you retire, that people will look back either at your retirement party, they will tell you, or, when they run into you off the street, say, you were one of the best leaders that I ever had. That's what I want for people that I work with. I want to raise the level of professionalism in this industry and to make you all more successful. In essence, what I say is I fill your bucket with candy, and then you go out and start your leadership fire. And that's what inspires me to do what basically help everybody that I encounter to be better leaders.
I love it. Thank you so much. It's all powerful. And like you said, we could go on for a couple hours. I'd love to hear stories and keep talking, but I think they'll do it for today. Maybe I can have you on in the future. And Bob, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
Just let me know. I would love to come back. It's been great. It doesn't even seem like it's been an hour yet. This has just gone by so quickly.
And that does it for this week's The Interview Room. I hope you really enjoyed it. Another great guest will be with us again next week. We have a great lineup for you here over the next few weeks and on through the rest of the year. So you're definitely not going to want to miss a single episode. We also have Morning Roll Call, which typically comes out on Monday mornings. However, I may change my mind, and who knows? It could come out a different day of the week. But Morning Roll Call, check that out as well. That's just me talking to you, and it gives us a few minutes to go over something, anything from news or something actionable that matters, hopefully, to you. One last favor, please, 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 whatever service you are looking at or whatever service you are watching this on, you're listening to this on, please leave us a rating and review. 5 stars, that would be the appropriate number of stars. If for some reason it's not 5 stars in your opinion, or if it is, tell us why. We would love to hear it. I would love to get your feedback. In fact, I'm going to start reading some of these reviews on the air. I've been looking at some of the ones on Apple Podcast, and thank you for the phenomenal reviews. And thank you all for taking the time to listen to this. I hope you're really enjoying it. You all have a safe week out there, and I will see you next week in the interview room. I will see you next week in Morning Roll Call, but in the meantime, I'll see you on the blue line.